welcome to today's episode, which I'm calling Inside the Nuclear Deal, What Powers Every Purchase at the United Kingdom's Decommissioning Authority. Let me set the stage. Most of us don't think about when nuclear decommissioning contracts begin or end up. But what if I told you there's a foundational document, one that dictates the fate of millions in taxpayer money, sets the standards for transparency, governs cutting-edge tech, manages confidential secrets, and even invokes security laws that sound like they came straight from an international thriller? And it's not glamorous. There's more legalese than lasers. Today, we walk through the general terms and conditions for the provision of goods and services for the United Kingdom's Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, every clause of it, and unpack why it is not your typical supplier contract. So, to start us off, why does the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority need such a dense, far-reaching document? Is it paranoia, good governance, or just the way the nuclear world ticks?
Great question. And honestly, it is all three, refashioned for risk management in one of the world's most regulated industries. When you handle radioactive materials, nuclear secrets, and some of the priciest long-term cleaning jobs the United Kingdom faces, you need ironclad protections. The authority cannot afford even an inch of ambiguity. This contract is designed to leave nothing to chance. Who owns the designs, what happens in a late delivery, the fate of confidential blueprints, and even the moral obligations of the supplier's staff. It is as much a shield as a handshake, a contract of trust, but with multiple tripwires, so every risk, from late invoices to espionage, is boxed in by tightly drafted rules.
Tightly drafted is putting it mildly. Even just in the definitions, they clarify that writing means anything from emailed contracts to facsimiles, and property covers everything intellectual from software code to the generalized moral rights. It feels like a contract that spent a night in a nuclear bunker, but right up front, it's made clear these conditions override anything a supplier might try to sneak in. Even if that supplier has sent their own long list of terms, this is a one-way street unless the authority says otherwise. Is that normal? Have you seen it lead to showdowns in practice?
Absolutely, it is the norm, especially with public authorities and highly regulated sectors like nuclear. They set the agenda. The one who holds the purse creates the rules. If a supplier tries to sneak in alternative terms in their acceptance, the authority simply refers to their own conditions and ignores the rest unless specifically agreed in writing. I have seen suppliers, sometimes major multinational companies, push back, but unless something is critical to their operation or very bespoke, the authority rarely budges. These contracts go through more due diligence than a merger, and every tiny concession is tracked in writing by legal teams from both sides.
That makes sense. I noticed on the environmental side, the authority insists suppliers comply with every law, regulation, and code of practice. Plus, observe good environmental practice, which sounds almost philosophical. Is that just lip service, or do they actually police it?
In the nuclear space, it is policed with almost missionary rigor. The authority's contracts often lead into site work, where breaches could set off headlines and parliamentary inquiries. I recall one case, a supplier's subcontractor improperly disposed of non-nuclear waste near Sellafield. Even though it was not strictly radioactive, just the link to the nuclear site triggered a forensic audit, and eventually, the supplier's removal from the approved list. Good environmental practice is not just window dressing. Non-compliance can lead to a contract being terminated and reputational damage that is, quite frankly, radioactive.
And then there's price. The authority seems almost allergic to surprises. The contract states price as listed, inclusive of everything except value-added tax, but no increases unless written consent is given. If value-added tax changes, the authority pays, but that's it. Why so strict?
Simple. Predictability drives public procurement. Budgets are set years in advance, and the authority's work is subject to intense parliamentary and public scrutiny. They cannot risk post-hoc cost surges, hidden delivery charges, or post-contract negotiations. The price must include packaging, travel, delivery, and any duties or taxes that might otherwise be overlooked, except value-added tax. Any change requires sign-off at the top levels. It is their way of keeping surprises, and the supplier's invoice creativity, out of the nuclear budget.
Let's dig into payment. Unless the order says otherwise, the authority pays within 30 days of a valid, undisputed invoice. There is a nod to the late payment of commercial debts, Interest Act 1998. Interest accrues if they are late, but the supplier cannot withhold goods as a result. How does this work in practice, and what about subcontracts?
In practice, the payment window is strictly monitored. If a supplier submits a correct invoice, referencing the correct order without errors, the authority has to pay within 30 days. If they do not, interest kicks in. But holding up nuclear waste handling or decommissioning is so serious, the supplier is forbidden from suspending deliveries just because they have not been paid. Imagine, for example, security doors not arriving on time. For subcontractors, the contract mandates the prime supplier to pay all subcontractors within a set period, max 30 days, to avoid the classic cash flow squeeze that can jeopardize smaller firms on big jobs.
On delivery, it is all about precision. The goods must be delivered to the specified address at the specified time along with documentation. If the delivery date is not set up front, the supplier has to give adequate notice, and remarkably, the authority can reject goods not matching the contract even after they have been delivered and essentially inspected. To me, it screams zero tolerance for defects. Does that level of inspection actually happen?
It absolutely does. And with nuclear, it is often more than one round of inspection. Initial physical, then forensic, and sometimes latent defects show up months or years later. The authority's ability to reject goods within a reasonable time after latent defects is crucial. In nuclear work, a tiny flaw unnoticed at delivery could turn into a vast safety issue later. I have seen cases where components passed standard checks but failed after post-installation stress tests. The supplier was still on the hook for replacement. It is intense, but safety culture demands it.
Risk and property transfer is another interesting clause. The supplier bears the risk until delivery. Ownership, or property, as they call it, passes on delivery unless the authority has already paid, in which case, once the goods are appropriated. Why the double clause, and has that ever led to headaches?
It is classic risk management. If the authority pays before delivery, say for special components, then as soon as the goods are appropriated to the contract, in other words, identified and set aside for the authority, they become the authority's property to avoid risk if the supplier goes insolvent. In reality, this saves the authority from having to claim with creditors in a bankruptcy. The goods are theirs, not part of the supplier's estate. I have seen this invoked when a supplier went into administration mid-project. No surprise, the authority's lawyers showed up, pointed to the contract, and those laser cutters, for example, were loaded onto trucks and shipped to Cumbria.
My favorite section, though, is intellectual property and confidentiality. Anything the supplier creates for the contract belongs to the authority outright, not just a license. Then, for anything they do not own but is necessary for use, the authority gets a perpetual, worldwide, royalty-free license and can even sublicense. Suppliers must also help the authority defend those rights and, importantly, indemnify the authority against third-party intellectual property claims. That's a sweeping, almost monopolistic approach. Does this scare suppliers off, or is it standard?
It does scare off smaller, innovation-driven suppliers sometimes. The authority is clear. If you invent a new decommissioning robot or a clever process on their dime, it is theirs. Otherwise, the taxpayer funds what amounts to private research. On indemnities, in one case, a supplier inadvertently copied proprietary software from a US contractor. Years later, a claim followed. Thanks to these clauses, the supplier itself, not the authority, bore the liability and paid damages. The authority considers intellectual property an essential national asset, especially when nuclear technology meets security risks.
That segues into security and the Official Secrets Act, the Atomic Energy Act, and mandatory security clearances for personnel. If someone fails to clear vetting, the supplier has to find a replacement, or the authority can terminate the contract. And suppliers must be aware of the criminal law under the Official Secrets Acts in 1911 to 1989. How fraught does this get for regular suppliers?
Fraught, and then some. Nuclear sites are among the most security sensitive in Europe. Every engineer and cleaner must pass security vetting, which can take months, and everyone signs the Official Secrets Act. I have had cases where a supplier's project lead had unrelated foreign ties and was refused clearance, halting the project until a substitute could be found. The contract gives the authority huge latitude to terminate and replace people. Suppliers must plan for this, or risk breaching the contract.
Transparency jumps out too. The authority is explicit. It may publish the full contract, tenders, and related documents unless doing so would reveal confidential or legally protected information under the Public Contracts Regulations or the Freedom of Information Act. If redaction is needed, the contractor is consulted. How often does this come up, and what are the tensions like?
It comes up all the time, particularly as government procurement moves toward radical transparency. Contractors sometimes fight this, worried about trade secrets, but the authority rarely backs down. If the law enables withholding, they redact. But otherwise, expect your pricing, specifications, and performance reports to become public. That keeps everyone honest and serves as a warning. This is not an environment for cutting corners or secret deals.
Monitoring and reporting also seem all-consuming. Suppliers may have to provide exhaustive management information, line amounts, project codes, descriptions, taxonomies, and every detail about spend and performance. The authority, and even the rest of Her Majesty's government, can analyze, share, and store this information. Is this oversight ever too much for suppliers, or is it par for the course?
For small suppliers, it can be overwhelming, especially with multiple reporting frameworks operating in parallel. But non-compliance is not really an option. Missed reports can mean withheld payments, audits, or even termination. For the authority, the benefit is enormous. Real-time oversight, benchmarking, and the ability to report to Parliament at a moment's notice. It is the wave of the future across government contracting.
The anti-bribery clause is tough too. Contractors must comply with the Bribery Act 2010 and ensure all associated persons do too, even if acting abroad. Seems designed to leave no room for plausible deniability.
Spot on. The authority is not just guarding nuclear assets, they are managing reputational risk for the whole public sector. Even the appearance of impropriety risks not just the deal, but parliamentary investigations and criminal prosecution. So, they write it into contract terms that bind everyone in the supply chain, globally.
And in the general provisions, there's a twist. Suppliers have to accept audits and inspections whenever the authority, its clients, or governmental overseers want. Plus, no assignment or passing on of the contract without written consent, and no third-party beneficiaries under the Contracts, Rights of Third Parties, Act 1999. And as is traditional, English law governs exclusively in the English courts. Seems standard, but is there any strategic weight to those extras?
Absolutely. Audit rights enforce accountability, while strictly limiting assignment ensures the authority knows who is actually doing the work, crucial for nuclear-sensitive operations. Limiting enforceability to named parties closes off unexpected lawsuits, and English law's certainty, coupled with local courts, protects the authority against costly jurisdiction fights or conflicting interpretations. It is the final set of locks on the nuclear vault.
So, to sum it all up, the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority's general contract is less a leash and more a force field, simultaneously giving suppliers the chance to serve at the heart of the United Kingdom's most sensitive, complex work, while holding them to standards that leave no ambiguity undisturbed. It's about trust, but verified, and then redacted and published. Thanks for breaking it all down for us. This was riveting. Thank you to all our listeners for joining us on another deep dive into the mechanics of major deals. See you in the next one.